Welcome to part 2 of Chapter 8 presentation on training. So when we think of training, there's a certain model that's we reach to think in terms of how to organize our scientific examination of it and pursuit of it. We have to recognize that there's characteristics of our trainees, there's a design to what we're doing, and there's a work environment in which all of this is happening. All these things combine to create a learning situation that all then becomes part of a transfer of the training to an actual job work. That is, do people actually turn the training into changes of what they do on the job? And so training characteristics, training design, and work environment all combine to what's done to create the learning. And then what is done to make transfer happen to the job is somewhat still a function of other training characteristics and work environment characteristics. So let's get into what some of these factors are. Training characteristics, and as I said before, learning styles is a just say no aspect of this. And as I said earlier, there's a lack of scientific evidence supporting the validity of learning styles. There is a preference for one style or another, but that does not make any difference in terms of outcomes. Training characteristics that do matter is things like their abilities and readiness. That is, if they come in the door lacking certain abilities for the learning situation, they're going to have a hard time using the training they have to be ready both in terms of their the abilities they've developed over the years, but also ready in terms of cognitive capabilities. Also needs to be taken into account that just as students sometimes have learning disabilities, which means unique allowances need to be made to improve their opportunities to learn. The same thing needs to be done in a training environment, in a business environment. There's also persons that have limited or exceptional motor learning capabilities that can have an effect upon what they're learning. And then persons' feelings of self-efficacy in the domain of training. Some people just don't feel like they're very good at something. I personally see this all the time with students who say they're not good at math, in fact, they are pretty good at math. They just don't realize it. They've become habituated to saying it. And it does inhibit their learning because there's a little bit of resistance to even trying until they go ahead and engage in the process somewhat. Motivation is another key factor for trainee characteristics. Sometimes the trainees are just not that motivated to learn this stuff. I'm seeing that right now with the rollout of the new curriculum management system on campus, Kuali. There's one person on campus I know of for sure that's just saying this is a complete waste of time and energy. I don't know why we're going through all this trouble. This person, I think, has intrinsic internal factors that are inhibiting their ability to learn this new software system. Some people are driven to seek new abilities, but other people are resistant to change. And being resistant to change can be a key feature in how training does or does not be effective in the material getting conveyed to people, but then in their implementation in particular. Extrinsic factors, these are outside factors that can be involved in how well people take on training. Job satisfaction is one, but also monetary rewards or other kinds of benefits can be part of creating an extrinsic motivation. Sometimes people are given bonus money for doing that outside training. Many years ago, we had difficulty getting faculty to do online courses. There was a monetary reward given to faculty who took the online training course. Personality factors also enter into this, and y'all are going to be Not too terribly surprised by the factors that play into the ocean factors, or canoe, or five factor, whichever name you're preferring, feed into it. And it will not necessarily surprise you that openness to new experiences and emotional stability are related to better training. And if we were doing this in class, I would ask y'all to come up with some reasons why that might be the case. Openness, because that willingness to engage in new ideas, new material, new places, new things, that just fits right in with being willing to do new training. Emotional stability means that a person is less likely to become a little anxious or worried about the fact that something new is happening and they're not sure how good they're going to be at it. Conscientiousness is related to worse outcomes in error training due to lowered self-efficacy. What happens with the conscientious person is, by learning about the myriad ways things can go wrong, they become concerned that they're not very good at doing something because they're now aware of how many ways it can go wrong. That is, their conscientiousness makes them hyper concerned about making an error, and that ends up actually causing a bit of a problem for them. It's kind of like, don't think of a white bear, and guess what you can't not think of? You're going to think of a white bear. Various kinds of designs have greater and lesser effectiveness in conveying information and training processes. We're going to talk about some of these: part training versus whole training, massed versus spaced. Part training versus whole simply means teaching things in small portions, spoonfuls, rather than the whole bowl. Whole training is just that, everything given to you in one sitting, essentially, or maybe several sittings over 1 week. Excuse me, that's really rude to do in the middle of a video. I'm sorry. Massed versus spaced is about whether or not you space it out versus have it all lumped into one thing, even if you have it broken into parts. These are closely related: part training versus whole, and massed versus spaced. Spaced is usually much better and matches to part training very well. Spaced means by taking, doing it day by day, small bits, like, an hour of training on the first day, an hour of training on the second day, and so forth, and spacing out the 8 hours of training over 8 days, you're more likely to have people take it on, because each day that's a comprehensible amount of material. In fact, as you can see, college courses are taught much in that kind of way. Overlearning is helpful too, because it helps people to attain automaticity. What we mean by this is the overlearning is when you learn something beyond simply knowing it. And so for a lot of the classes that I teach, I have quizzing set up, and I really encourage students to take the quizzes even if they've attained a necessary or desired grade on the quiz, because it's the opportunity to do overlearning, so that you really don't just know it if you have to retrieve it, but you know it cold, and you become more automatic about it. Overlearning is particularly helpful when you're talking about processes that have an emergency characteristic, or something that requires relatively speedy response, because you don't have time to be remembering it. You've got to act, and you got to act accurately. Space training, I want to spend a little time on what is optimal there. An interesting study done in the mid-2000s was about how to increase retention without increasing the amount of time spent studying. There's good evidence to support overlearning and optimal time distance for space training. Well, what do we mean by an optimal time difference? Well, what you've got is a first session of training and a test and evaluation day that's down the line. Imagine in a situation that it's 30 days between the session where you first learned about something and then the test day. Well, the second session set at about 10 to 20% of the time to the evaluation leads to an optimal retention of information. That is, if the first session is at day 0 and the test evaluation is 30 days later, then between 3 and 6 days after the first session, if you do a really good detailed review, then you're going to be optimally preparing yourself. And then a good review, just like the night before or the morning before an afternoon exam, can kind of help reinforce it all even more. Never hurts to do it more. So, training designs that emphasize active styles tend to produce better results, particularly for skill-based training. So, what you're doing by using these methods is get meaningful and applicable material in front of the student, and then they can receive timely and faster feedback on what they're doing if it's in the classroom setting. So we're seeing an increased use of virtual reality systems and simulations, and also an increase in gamification of training, just as you're seeing it also in education. I have tried some gamification concepts, and even though I'm an avid gamer, I find I'm not able to create them very well. And I think it's because I need tools that kind of help me along, and I'm not real good at having to monitor and run the game myself. I need some systems to run a lot of it for me. So I've yet to find a way to do it that makes me, as an instructor, as a working person doing this job, happy with what I'm doing. And then we get into evaluating training. How has it gone? There are several things we can evaluate according to the Kirkpatrick model. That is, reactions by the employees, the trainees. How did they feel about the training? Then, what is their learning? What do they know after the training is done? And finally, what do they, or not finally, but what do they do? Do we actually see a change in behavior by examining trainees' behavior? And finally, what's the effect on the organization? Did the organization have some change that it was seeking to have happen? If the goal is to maybe reduce the number of employees that need to work in the warehouse by increasing the efficiency of the warehouse workers by a method of knowing and planning, picking up several items rather than item at a time or something, as I might imagine, then how can that be done to, and are we actually seeing the results at the end of the day? That means we can now run this warehouse with 100 people rather than trying to find 20 more, which is what we used to run it at, and we've gotten down from our 120 and we need to hire 20 more. Do we actually need to replace them, or have we gained it with the new efficiencies? What's the organizational results? So the main level of evaluation is usually done with reactions. How do the employees feel about the training, and do they believe they got useful information? The reason this is the main level of evaluation is it's easy to get. They are there. They are sitting in front of you when you're doing the training, and so you can pass out reaction sheets and you've got it. Learning, testing to determine if the trainees took in the information, is also fairly easy to do, and they're done, and they often show positive effects of training. So, because they're easy and they tend to show positive effects, they get done a lot. But obviously, those aren't the only things. Someone can learn about something, but that doesn't mean they're doing it. So, performance level outcomes are really where we want to see good outcomes happen. Behavioral is by observing the on-job behaviors. Are people actually doing their jobs differently, performing better, making differences in their everyday work? Are the changes reflective of the training, or are they different from it? They changed it, but they didn't actually do what the training said. They got a glimpse of how to do it like the training, but they actually still didn't implement well. It's also organizational results. Are we seeing a lowering of cost, or an increase in productivity, or happier customers, or whatever the indicators were that being hoped for? Reactions are correlated with training factors, anxiety and pre-training motivation. Do people come in with a positive attitude? They're going to tend to have a positive reaction. Anxiety-oriented persons are going to tend to have lower positivity about the training. They're worried about how they can do it. Trainer factors, their style and interaction method. Do they present in a positive way with an engaging style, one that is not boring? That's one thing I try to not be as boring, but I sometimes am because I'm a human that have better and lesser days. And so do they do well with that? We don't see many correlations with performance level outcomes from these things. Most intriguing is the low amount of actual evaluation of actual effectiveness. Only 54% of programs evaluated for learning. Only 23% of programs evaluated for transfer to on-the-job behavior or result. Most evaluations is about trainees' reactions. And this is kind of terrible because that's where it really matters. But it's hard to do. If you're going to be evaluating what the behaviors are that are happening out there on the floor in the office, you've got to have observers. And the observers, well, there's a couple of problems. Number one, it's expensive to have people be observers. But number two, their presence can't help but alter people's behavior. Well, you could have other employees be the observers, but then people know it's still, they know it's happening. And so it's hard to know if you're getting a genuine good measurement. Observing behaviors is hard. Now, if you have covert observations going on of some kind, like video that's always present anyway, you can sometimes use that, and that can give you a good sense of whether or not the behavior is changing. A little word here at the end about executive coaching. I urge extreme caution in seeking out this kind of thing. There's actually terribly little evidence to support that it's good. If it is so good, where are the studies? It seems like those should be out there. The studies I have found in searching were connected to known marginal and or bogus practices such as EMDR and its various other forms and names. EMDR is eye motion desensitivity and reactivity or something like that. Basically, it's having you move your eyes in certain ways when you think of things. It's not good. But because your executives often are extremely costly, both in having them hired, paying them, but the recruitment process is extremely expensive. And so anything that can reassure the folks that are spending the money that they're getting the most out of their executives after they've hired them feels like a low cost to pay because of the expense of having to get another executive if the one you've got ends up not being as effective as you need. This opens the door for quick fixes by charlatans, people who come in and say, oh yes, I can do the executive coaching. I have all kinds of books and training manuals and stuff. I can definitely do that, and it's all, bogus. So I urge great caution there. The evidence is weak at best, but the evidence hasn't been even done enough to know if it doesn't work. So it's kind of, it's in a gray zone. And that's where we end at this point. We'll be coming back to meet and do motivation. Thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.